Hi everyone, welcome back to the Literature Life. This is part 6 of the essay by Greenblatt and Gallagher called Counter History and the Anecdote. This is the last part of the 6 video series on this topic, and this part concerns Michel Foucault, the very acknowledged, highly appreciated critical thinker, a French critical thinker and philosopher. And he has made, of course, a great impact on Gallagher and Greenblatt, and that's why he forms this most important part, the conclusive part of this essay, and also the new historicist thinking. All right. So, at the outset, I have to tell you that some people have emailed me that they need the last part urgently. So, although I wasn't prepared with a perfect draft the way I would have wanted it to go. So, whatever information, whatever draft and material I have about it, I'm going to form a video and upload it for you. So, I don't think this video is going to be perfect, but I'm sure it's going to help you quite a bit. Okay, so let's go on. In the last 5 parts, Greenblatt has built an argument, and it goes something like this. Anecdotes, those little stories that challenge grand histories, are often ignored by mainstream historians. They consider it as something not so important or having representative value. But counter-historians rely on anecdotes to recover some individuals, some stories, some aspects of their consciousness that had been hidden or that has been erased or that, in other words, hasn't been allowed to appear at all. And if it appears at all, it appears in very negative, very brief terms. So, historians pick those anecdotes and try to form counter-history. Anecdotes are the sites where we encounter history's other, whatever mainstream history has othered, those lives are encountered in anecdotes. So, Greenblatt and Gallagher continue that the British culturalists like Williams and Thompson, they modified the Enlightenment era humanism. We have done that in the last 2 parts. What is Enlightenment era humanism? That took a certain type of elite human as its subject. This human had some set prerequisites. This is the kind of human the Enlightenment era humanism took as its subject. So, what Williams and Thompson and here Foucault will do is that they imagine this other of grand history, all right. They don't take the typical elite human as their subject, and they imagine the other of grand history. This other is a locus of alternative possibility. Other histories are possible, other discourses, other narratives are possible, other lives were possible. Okay. So, now in this section we conclude this essay by highlighting the contribution of Michel Foucault, the most significant influence on new historicism, and especially people like Greenblatt and Gallagher. Michel Foucault's work, as you must be knowing, I'm hoping, his work on the discursive nature, the constructed nature of knowledge, shows us how dissemination of power is carried on through the production, through the control on production of knowledge, all right. The whole essay has been establishing this point, but Foucault says it clearer than anybody else that power has a discursive nature. It is a knowledge has a discursive nature. It is constructed, and who constructs it and who controls it, who produces it? It is the structures of power. This power knowledge question has been, obviously, you must be knowing, it has been the cornerstone of critical theory and has taught us, it teaches us to look with doubtful eyes all discourses that look natural, normal, too established or too strong to be challenged. With this quick introduction, we come to the text. So, even if the British culturalists had modified their humanism, their counter-historical impulses might nevertheless have required them to imagine an other of history's determinations. If not a repressed natural man, then at least some discernible locus of alternative possibilities. Michel Foucault was one counter-historian who consciously tried to root sentimental nostalgia for such beings out of his work, and yet confessed in the late 1970s that encounters with those who remained unassimilated into the narratives of power. Please, if you don't mind, underline this. Encounters with those who remained unassimilated into the narratives of power had always animated his studies. He was looking for narratives that remained unassimilated into power. A Little Red Text from 1979 is perhaps the best expression of Foucault's counter-historical ardor. This is in no way a history book. How peculiar. Begins the introduction to The Life of Infamous Men, and it continues. What is this if this is not a history book? This is an anthology of existences, lives of a few lines or a few pages, countless misfortunes and adventures gathered together in a handful of words. Brief lives chanced upon in books and documents, singular lives, those which have become through I do not know what accidents, strange poems. This is what I wanted to gather together in a sort of herbarium. Okay, so we shouldn't miss the fact that whatever Foucault and Greenblatt just said tells you that history could be subjective, that the discourse of objectivity which mainstream historians try to maintain so vehemently is not the only necessary course history has to go. In fact, counter histories depend on subjective perspectives and other histories. Okay. So in this section, Greenblatt begins by stating that although Foucault maintained that yes, a historian should be objective and should not be moved by stories of their subjects, however, in 1979, he confessed that he was quite moved with intensity. See, the excerpt has been taken from the Life of Infamous Men. This is an essay which forms the introduction to Foucault's book, one of Foucault's books called Power. Okay. In 1979, in that text, the Life of Infamous Men, he says that he was quite moved with intensity when he encountered some lives within anecdotes. So imagine that he's not saying that he encountered stories, he encountered narratives, he encountered texts, he encountered lives within anecdotes. These lives that refuse to be assimilated, restrained into narratives of power, in other words, have resisted grand history of the powerful. And Foucault begins the essay by saying that this is in no way a history book. A historian starting a historical text, saying it's no way a history book. His intention is clear. He doesn't want this text to be assimilated into mainstream history. It's in itself an act of resistance. So if it's not a history book, what is it then? It is an anthology of existences, as if the lives, their very existences have been brought in their original form to appear on the paper. Without wrapping these lives, their stories with analysis or explanation. These lives are brought in a few pages, in a few lines of words. There's no detailed grand accounts of these lives. Brief lives chanced upon in books and documents. There were no separate books on these people, and their lives, the reader like Foucault chanced upon them while reading other books. So obviously these are anecdotes that were not supposed to perform the function they eventually performed for historians like Foucault. Perhaps like we find every anecdote in a grand history. These lives appear like strange poems according to Foucault. Now, in my opinion, why does Foucault compare these lives to strange poems? Because what happens when we read a strange poem? It moves us in a peculiar way, in a strange way. We get a pleasure on discovering them, and yet we try hard to understand them and failing to do so because they are so opposite of convention, so opposite of the normal practice. So Foucault says that he has gathered together these lives in this text like one gathers herbs in their flavor of choice in a personal herbarium. Alright, so this means Foucault was not entirely being objective. He picked up lives that moved him in a strange way, like a strange poem moves its readers. Okay, so again, the subjectivity point is so clear here that history can be subjective, and that was one of the main points of the new historicist thinkers. Alright, let's quickly move back to the text. The life of infamous men was to be composed entirely of anecdotes of the obscure and atypical, chosen unsystematically for their emotional force. The selection the selection that shall be found in it has confirmed to nothing more important than my taste, my pleasure and emotion, laughter, surprise, a certain fright, or some other feeling whose intensity perhaps I would have difficulty justifying now that the first flush of discovery is past. The introduction delivers one of the fullest and liveliest expressions of the period's counter-historical impulse, declaring his fascination with the ephemerality of and the visceral effectiveness of these fragmented and miniature stories. Foucault articulates even the contradiction between anecdotes and their incorporation into his historical texts. So, Greenblatt observes that the life of infamous men was to be composed of anecdotes of those people who were obscure and atypical. Okay, so I read the life of infamous men and I found that the characters in the essay were so peculiar, were so strange. They were accused of sodomy, they were accused of dismemberment, they were accused of cannibalism, and of course all of them were tagged as lunatics. They were obscure and they were atypical. They were not those who were not normal according to the social standards of the time. They were not representative. They did not form the majority of people and they were difficult to frame in a category. But why were such lives chosen? Because of their emotional force. Now, this is the factor that we have to focus on. This is the distinguishing factor of new historicist thinking, that anecdotes were chosen for their emotional force. Here, Foucault kicks all the claims and questions of objectivity out of the window. When Foucault first encountered these lives, and he encountered them by chance, the first sensation, the first feeling was that of a pleasure, an emotion, a laughter, a surprise, a certain fright, or perhaps some other feeling which is now difficult to describe because the intensity of the feeling was only potent, was only at its strongest when it was first encountered. When he first encountered these people, the kind of feeling, the kind of sensation he felt at that point of time was hard to feel again. And this is a point Greenblatt tries to prove all through the next few pages, and that quite sums up the entire argument, that the first flush of feeling felt by the reader when he encounters these lives, such anecdotes, such flush of feeling cannot be reproduced. It cannot be arrested in words, no matter how hard the historian or the counter-historian tries. Now, to be a little off point, notice the similarity between Williams' concept of the real intense experience, which is only felt once and can never be described, can never be explained, articulated, and the similarity between Williams' concept of real intense experience and Foucault's intense feeling on discovering these anecdotes, which can never be, the sensation, intense feeling that can never be felt again. The bottom line appears that real intense experiences, life stories, consciousnesses, and anecdotes about them are hard to pin down, hard to recreate on a piece of paper once the initial feeling has passed. Greenblatt states that the introduction to the real, introduction that Foucault just gives you about the life of infamous men is the liveliest expression of the counter-historical impulse of the 1970s. If you want to know what the counter-historical impulse was in the 1970s, we should go back to the introduction Foucault provides in the life of infamous men, and we should go back to the fact that a counter-historian looks for anecdotes and accounts that move them, move their feeling, and also his acknowledgement that the feeling that he felt first on encountering the story, encountering the anecdote, is hard to reproduce. Okay, that is the counter-historical impulse of the late 1970s. Foucault expresses his fascination with the ephemerality, the fleetingness, the temporariness. The flush of feeling is so fleeting, so slippery, so impermanent that he knew he would not be able to catch that intense impulse again. And the visceral effectiveness is the word that Greenblatt used, and I am simplifying it for you. The visceral effectiveness, instinctual relevance, the quality of appealing to the instinct, the quality of being arising from the instinct of these anecdotes, but also maintains, Greenblatt also maintains that there is always a contradiction between such anecdotes and their incorporation into the historical text. Now, what is the contradiction? By now, I am hoping that you already know. I have stated it 2 or 3 more times. What is the contradiction? We have to see in the text from now, okay? So, the text says, a long time ago, I utilized similar documents for a book. If I did so, then it is doubtless on account of that vibration which I feel even today when I happen to run across these lowly lives reduced to ashes in a few phrases that have destroyed them. The dream would have been to restore their intensity in an analysis. For want of the necessary talent, I therefore brooded for a long time over analysis alone. I sought the reason for which the poor spirits had been so zealously prevented from walking upon unknown paths, but the primary intensities which had motivated me remained outside. And since there was a risk that they might not pass into the order of reasons, wasn't it best to leave them in the same form which had made me experience them? So, Foucault remembers a similar experience, similar previous experience. He could conclude that by including such lives into a text, by including such lives and by analyzing them, a historian, a counter-historian or historian only destroys them. How? This is the contradiction. He tries to retain them, but in the act of retaining, he kills their essence. He means that the originality, the intensity, the real sensational quality of these lives evaporates when a historian tries to analyze them. And he takes their essence out, while his dream, any counter-historian's dream, was to restore and preserve their force in an analysis. Why would he include them? Why would he analyze them? Because he wants to preserve them. Alright, so he thought about the idea for a long time, argued that these lives deserve inclusion in historical narrative, but he could not bring himself to agree, because whenever he imagined an analysis, the primary sensations, the strong feeling that accompanied his discovery of these lives was lost. Foucault found himself doubtful of whether he could bring these lives and make them appear understandable to people so accustomed to a linear, normal history. He thought it best to leave them in their original state, so that the same feeling that he had on discovering them could stay alive in those pages for someone else like Foucault to discover them. Had he analyzed those lives, most people would have understood what Foucault was trying to say, but the sensation, the feeling, the strong emotion that came when he discovered those lives would have gone away. So he decided to retain these lives in their original form and not meddle with them by explanation, by a teleological narrative with it. Okay? Let's come back to the text. The frisson of the anecdotal rupture, the flash of the undiscernible real, the use of historical analysis to arrest and know what made that fleeting effect, the disappointing realization that the original intensity of the anecdote's effect has thus been lost, and the hope that reproducing the anecdote shorn of analysis and surrounding narrative would restore its pristine effect. The whole conflictual dynamic of counter-history and history is summed up in this paragraph. So Greenblatt highlights the cycle that Foucault brings in. It's like a cycle of life and death. How? Greenblatt names it the whole conflictual dynamic of counter-history and history. The first step in the cycle is the shiver, the sensation that the anecdote has created in the reader, here Foucault. So the first step in this cycle is the sensation. He felt a sudden flash, a force of something real that could not be understood. This is the first thing that happened. Then comes his attempt to catch the sensation, arrest it, write it down, analyze the experience into words, retain it. But this is instantly met with a disappointment to know that the intensity, the force of the original experience cannot be felt twice, cannot be arrested. the first sensation has been lost, and the hope that if he reproduces, he included the lives in their original form without trying to analyze them, that may retain their original intensity and force, which may once again lead to the first sensation of discovering such lives and their force. So, discovering the anecdote, feeling that first feeling, the first emotion and sensation is like the birth of the feeling, of the anecdote, of the counter historical impulse. And a counter historian trying to pin it down, losing its essence, losing the feeling, is kind of the death of anecdote. So, Foucault tries to leave the anecdote as it is, leave these anthology of these lives as it is, so that some other reader like Foucault would come back to these lives and feel the sensation, feel the flush of emotions himself, and thus motivating another rebirth of those lives. Okay? So, this is what this paragraph means, and I am coming back to the text again. It seems obvious that Foucault spoke directly to those issues that British culturalists had clustered around the anecdote. His early work especially had an undeniable appeal for those who wanted to break the continuities of the grand receipt, to hear the voices of histories excluded, to escape from lingering economism and the constraints of orthodox Marxist chronology, to reflect on their own investments in the past, to study the shaping power of discursive activity, and to attend to the unsaid. Even if you underline this section, his early work had an undeniable appeal for those who wanted to do a couple of things. These are the couple of things that are the gist of the new historicist impulse, the counter-historical impulse. They all want to break the continuities of the grand receipts. They all want to hear the voices of histories excluded. They all want to escape from economism, being really wise about what you say, really rational about what you write into history. And the constraints of orthodox Marxist chronology, they all spoke against it. To reflect on their own investments in the past. This is one of the most important point about counter history, about new historicism. I have made a video on new historicism, and I have tried to recount new historicist issues in 10 points, and one of the points is this, that a new historicist is able to reflect on their own investment in the past. They can't stand outside the past saying that we are historians, we are objective. No, you are involved. You have invested yourself in the past, and this is you bring your point of view when you write history. To study the shaping power of discursive activity, to know that knowledge is discursive, power constructs knowledge and it's discursive, and to attend to the unsaid. These are the most important points of the essay, and since it's a conclusive section, maybe Greenblatt tries to sum it up all for you. So I hope you have underlined it and you will remember it for your essays. Without minimizing the equally obvious differences between the British culturalism and Foucault's more skeptical Nietzschean brand of counter-history, we should recognize that they converged in significant ways. In reading Foucault, however, one additionally felt attraction, indeed the relief, of encountering an author who could acknowledge and reflect on the pathos of anecdotalism. The strong desire to preserve the energies of the anecdote by channeling them into historical explanation, which is followed by frustration and disappointment when the historical project stills and stifles the very energies that provoked it. Foucault was not just doing counter history, he seemed to be living its paradoxes as an intense drama that all of us shared whenever we set out, as we constantly did, to capture the animation, the dynamism of things that were bound to become inert and passive under our disciplinary gaze. So, although it's quite simple to understand what this para means, it's almost a recounting of points. So, I'm hoping that you've already understood what this means. The most important points I've already mentioned. So, whatever has not been explained, I'll explain it now. Greenblatt says that obviously these issues sound the same as those raised by the culturalists like Williams and Thompson, all right. The list of 5-6 factors that I just gave you. So these are the same issues that Williams and Thompson also raised. But what was different about Foucault? That he wanted to question his own standpoint. He wanted to observe and question the force of discourses on power mechanisms. He wanted to attend to the unsaid like other counter historians, but he wanted to analyze his own position. So once again we come back to the focus on the unsaid. Now Greenblatt says that obviously there are differences between Thompson, Williams and Foucault, but there are points where they converge which are similar in both these British culturalists and Foucault. He says that specifically readers like us are relieved to read Foucault's work because he is one of the very few authors who can observe and talk about the pathos, the paradox of anecdotalism. And what is the paradox of anecdotalism? I just told you, the paradox that the moment you try to retain them, you lose it. You lose the anecdotes, okay? This is the paradox. It is quite tragic that because the act of preserving the anecdote and its original intense energy becomes the act that actually destroys those energies. It is not about theory, he seems to say. He seems so involved, Foucault seems so involved in the discovering the stories and realizing the tragic aspects of his job as a historian that he appears to be living the drama. Foucault is so involved, he is so emotionally invested that it appears that he is living the drama of a counter-historian's job. This is a drama that all counter-historians live when they try to capture the force of something that instantly becomes passive, instantly becomes inactive, inert, as soon as you put your disciplinary gaze onto it. An anecdote or experience loses its intensity once we start to apply theoretical frameworks on it, right? This is what he means. The drama, the intense disappointment that one has to face when he tries to catch the essence of something so fleeting, and realizes that the act of catching its essence, the act of analyzing, the act of arresting into narrative is the act that has killed the essence actually. The disciplinary gaze, the historical methods of narrating, adapting, evaluating renders the essence, the initial force, the energy, the intensity dead. This was not just theory, it was an act of introspection. Your reflection of yourself as a historian. It's again, Greenblatt says, a problem of behavior, something personal, not theoretical. All right, with this I come to the next paragraph. This combined personal and disciplinary self-reflectiveness, to be sure, had advantages other than dramatic pathos as well. For one thing, it seemed to provide an alternative to the starkly posed choice between culturalist or humanist and structuralist viewpoints. Instead of either marshalling anecdotes to represent freestanding alternative social subjects or systematizing them into a set of ideological templates for interpolated subjectivities, Foucault presented the anecdotes in the historical archives as residues of the struggle as residues of the struggle between unruly persons and the power that would subjugate or expel them. So yeah, this is another sentence that would form the basis of the pages to come. So I request you to underline this, it's really, really important. Foucault presented the anecdotes in the historical archives as residues of the struggle between unruly persons and the power that would subjugate or expel them. All right, I'll explain this to you. He thus focused theoretical attention on the archive, the source of the anecdotes, to explain how those elements that were putatively outside of history could become most visible precisely at the moment of their expulsion. The anecdotes were therefore produced by the workings of power, but they also demonstrated that power relied on those who resisted it. It is one of the most popular ideas, most acknowledged ideas of Foucault that he pointed out, that power relied on those who resisted it. It is also one of the major ideas of the new historicist thought. Power relied on those who resisted it. The anecdote binds structures and what exceeds them, history and counter-history, into a knot of conflicted interdependence. So Greenblatt states that this self-reflectiveness, this introspection about one's methods, one's acts as a historian, has other advantages than just the realization of the tragic pathos of anecdotalism. We just talked about tragic pathos of anecdotalism. The first advantage was that it is an alternative to the culturalist, humanist or structuralist viewpoints. In the previous sections, we have critiqued the structuralist viewpoint, then we came to the humanist viewpoint, and then we came to the culturalist viewpoint. So Foucault's point of view was an alternative to all these three viewpoints. He presented a choice between the culturalist approach of using the anecdote as a freestanding alternative social subject, or the structuralist approach of systematizing them into ideological tools that interpellated subjects according to the ideology theory. Okay, so Foucault presented an alternative. But how did he present an alternative? By giving a fresh view. And what was his view? His view was, and this is really important, he viewed anecdotes as residues of the struggle between the unruly people and the power that would subjugate or expel them. He viewed anecdotes as the traces of a struggle. From where did the anecdote come? It came because there was a struggle that took place between the people who resisted and the people who controlled that resistance. There was a resistance and there was a control of that resistance, and that was caught in the anecdote. So he focused his attention on the archive, where he found the anecdotes to show that these anecdotes have been carefully kept out, invisible, insignificant. These anecdotes became most visible at the moment of their expulsion, the moment in which the forces of power were almost able to extinguish them, suppress them. They were either put in jail or put in a lunatic asylum, or they were executed. Wherever the clash between the unruly people and power, there is an anecdote where we can experience the energy of these lives. In a way, it is the anecdotes, the evidence of resistance, that makes visible an important phenomenon. What is the phenomenon? Listen carefully. When the unruly people resist, the power structures try to douse the resistance. We have covered that much. If there was no resistance, and obviously no act of ending that resistance, how would we have known that these power structures even exist? In a way, the anecdotes, the stories of unruly people being suppressed by the powerful, made the power visible. So Foucault makes a very important observation and concluded that we should remember that power relies on those who resist it. Their resistance makes the power visible. The anecdote that we found in those archives performs an important function. It binds the power structures to the structure of resistance. See, the power structures would be nowhere, we wouldn't know that they exist if there was no act of resistance. So, to make the power visible, we need the resistance. Also, in the lecture on new historicism, I told you that at the moment they try to expel the power, there is a hidden motive in expelling resistance. Power structures expel resistance with another motive. They want to show the other unruly people, right? To show them that if you resist, you would be put into jail or into an asylum, or you would be obviously executed. So they want to set an example. So power needs such unruly people. And power exists because these unruly people resisted their oppression. So thus, history is bound with counter-history. Power structures are bound with unruly people. It is a knot of conflicted interdependence, meaning that they will always be in conflict, but they will always be interdependent. Power and unruly people are bound. History and counter-history is bound in the same manner. Okay? So let's move ahead with the text. This paradox of the anecdote corresponds inversely to the pathos of the anecdotalist. The structures of power preserve the errant subjects in the very act of apprehending and destroying them. Conversely, the counter-historian clutches the life of the anecdote, but it expires in his or her grasp. The life of the infamous men is concerned with both dynamics. It is both an effort at resurrecting the lives outside and an argument that reanimation can only be achieved by the eclat of rereading the death sentence. Foucault's own desire to pass along his sensation of terror and awe on the one hand and his desire to normalize it by explaining its social function on the other remains irreconcilable. Neither impulse wins out. The anecdote is not ultimately in the service of the explanation, nor is the explanation just an excuse for repeating the anecdote. In Joel Feynman's terms, neither the activity of tearing nor that of repairing is allowed to dominate. The anecdotes were to be drawn from archives of confinement, police, petitions to the king, letters de cachet of Foucault's classical age, that was 1660 to 1760. Moreover, to heighten their paradoxical drama, Foucault also imposed a performative condition for inclusion. The passages had to be not only the records of encounters between power and obscurity, but also the very instruments of the encounters themselves. So we see that there is a clear paradox. The power structures were trying to eliminate the unruly people, but in the act of suppressing them, they leave an event, a story of their suppression. This story becomes the anecdote later, and the anecdote thus preserves the life of the unruly. So, in a sense, power, by suppressing these agents of resistance, these unruly people, these obscure people, power in the act of suppressing them kind of retains them. So you see what an interesting argument Greenblatt has formed. Counter-historians who are trying to retain the anecdotes are killing their essence. And power structures who are trying to kill the unruly people, kill the agents of resistance, are retaining their story, are retaining their lives. So this is the paradox, this is the conflictual interdependence that Greenblatt talks about. Okay. So Greenblatt goes on to say that the act of discovery of such anecdotes is equated with tear, and the act of acknowledging the position of a counter-historian, that as soon as he tries to retain the anecdote with an analysis and explanation, that is called repair. So he says the discovery and the awareness, the discovery of the anecdote and the awareness that he is going to kill it the moment he tries to include it in a narrative, is tear and repair, and he uses Joel Feynman's term to explain that. But where are we going to find such anecdotes? So Greenblatt mentions that Foucault has stated that the anecdotes were to be found in the archives of confinement, police, petitions to the king, etc. from 1660 to 1760. Apart from being weird and outlandish, the anecdotes, like the preconditions set out in the first section of this essay, being weird and outlandish was the first precondition for an anecdote to be included in counter history, to be a source of counter history. There was, in this case, in Foucault's case, there was one other condition which needed to be met when Foucault selected these anecdotes, that these anecdotes were not representative. See, when someone says that something is not representative, it means that it's a minority thing. It is not a majority thing. It's not representative of the majority, all right. So one, these anecdotes should not be representative, all right. They should not be the record of encounter. They should be the encounter themselves. It means that these anecdotes will act like a moment in which we can witness how they create the first shudder of sensation. It's not a story, it's an experience. And the moment a historian puts his disciplinary gaze on the moment, on the anecdote, on the first sensation, the anecdote will die. the sensation, the essence would die. Okay. So one, that it has to be weird and outlandish, and second, that it isn't the narrative of the encounter, it isn't the explanation and teleological narration of the anecdote, it is the experience itself. Alright, it is the first sensation itself, it is not the explanation of that first sensation, it is the explanation itself. And the moment a historian views it with theoretical lens, with theoretical tools, the first sensation dies, it loses its essence. Alright, so let us continue. I haven't sought to unite texts which would be more faithful to reality than others. Reality is not his concern. Which would merit selection for their representative value. Okay, no representative value. But texts which played a role in this real of which they speak. They speak of a real situation, and these texts would play a role in that reality, which in turn find themselves, whatever their inexactitude, their turgidity or their hypocrisy may be, transversed by it. The reality, no matter how weird, no matter how outlandish, no matter how hypocrite those texts may appear, but the reality is altered by these texts. These are fragments of discourse trailing the fragments of a reality in which they take part. They are fragments of discourse which are trailing behind actual fragments of reality in which they take part. What shall be read here is not a collection of portraits, they are not stories, they are not character sketches, they are snares, they are weapons, cries, gestures, attitudes, ruses, intrigues for which the words have been the instruments. The words are just instruments. What are these anecdotes? These are weapons, these are cries, these are the first-hand accounts that create this sort of sensation in the historian. These existences have effectively been risked and lost in these words. So we see that Foucault has imposed a performative condition on inclusion of these anecdotes. Alright, the anecdotes were included only if they met this performative condition. These anecdotes will not only be a record of an event of resistance, but they will themselves be an instrument of change. So in this quote, he states clearly that he is not choosing the anecdotes for the reasons normal historians would choose them, but he has chosen texts that play a role in the reality of which they speak. They may be inexact, they may be, these anecdotes, they may be inexact, they may be exaggerated, even hypocritical. What Foucault is looking for is fragments of discourse trailing the fragments of reality in which they take part. Foucault acknowledges that the anecdotes which he chose for the lives of men are fragments of discourse. He is not claiming they are complete stories, narratives, all right. They are massive books about lives of kings or prime ministers. He is not saying that. These are fragments of discourse trailing behind the fragments of reality. He is not claiming that they represent absolute reality. They are not claiming that these are just narratives. These anecdotes are fragments of reality. They are fragments, and they are fragments of reality in which they take part. The anecdotes take part in that reality. They perform. They are agents and not passive narratives. We must not read them as collection of portraits, but as snares, weapons, cries, gestures, attitudes, intrigues for which words have been the instruments. A historian should acknowledge all this. His subjective position, his personal favor for these anecdotes. This is one of the main points of new historicists, as I told you. These existences have been risked and lost in these words. All right. So with this, I move ahead. He does not deny that apart from these words, there were lives, but he doubts that we could hear such loud echoes of them in any less tumultuous record. The most intense point of lives, the one where their energy is concentrated, is precisely where they clash with power, struggle with it, endeavor to utilize its forces or to escape its traps. These words are what gives to them, in order to travel through time, the brief flash of sound and fury which carries them even to us. So Foucault says that behind these words, these anecdotes, there were actual lives as well, but one can't hear them in any less tumultuous record. What is the tumultuous record? When did these anecdotes come into being? They came into being at the most intense point of lives, the point where their energy is concentrated. And what is that point where their energy is concentrated? Where they clash with power, where they struggle with power. They either use the power or they try to escape the power. Wherever these existences, these unruly people were doing all these above things, or either of them, they were struggling with it, they were clashing with power, they were trying to utilize power, or they were trying to escape the power. It is at that precise point that their energy is concentrated. It is that tumultuous record that arose from that record of resistance. All right. So those accounts, those archival matters that gave words to that resistance, to that concentration of energy, those are the tumultuous record Foucault is talking about. All right. So these words are what gives to them, in order to travel through time, the brief flash of sound and fury which carries them even to us. Those words that captured that concentration of energy, the tumultuous records, those are the words which bring those accounts to us. These are the words that give those accounts the brief flash of sound and fury. Had they not resisted, had that resistance not been recorded in official archives, they would not have come to us. We would not have felt that sensation. We would not have been counter historians reading them and finding that first sensation, that pleasure. So all that was possible because these records of resistance were recorded in these tumultuous narratives. So I am back to the text. Of course, there has to be a medium through which the sound carries. What is the medium? The words. And where are the words found? In the archives. But Greenblatt says the archive itself is an insufficient echo chamber. The anecdotalist, in the attempt to wake the dead, must know where to find them and how to publicize them, and this knowledge, it turns out, is provided by the historical continuities between the sovereign power that overcame those lives and the discipline he or she practices. Here is yet another knot binding the desire to resurrect life and the power to end it. Anecdotalists are implicated, it seems, in the annihilating force indebted to the lightning flash of power, because it makes the only illumination by which we can see what counter-historians want to see, that which is thrown out of official history, the other of power, the means by which it is discarded. Moreover, we are further involved because we are the linear heirs of the methods of infamy that those disposers of the lives of the obscure employed. Of course, those who dealt out the punishments were not yet creating the languages of the human sciences, but for all of their bombast and invective, they are establishing a new relation between power, discourse, and the everyday. Quite a different way of regulating the latter and formulating it. And without the introduction of everyday life into discourse, where would the counter-historian be? So in this paragraph, the main point that Greenblatt makes is that somehow the power structures that suppressed the unruly people and the historian who's trying to feel that first sensation and trying to retain it in narrative are somehow complicit with each other. How they are complicit with each other, we'll see in this paragraph. First of all, Foucault says that how would anyone recognize anecdotes like this? How would you recognize such anecdotes? How would I recognize? We will recognize these anecdotes now because we've read New Historicism, because we've read Foucault, we have read Greenblatt, we know how history selects its texts, we know how historians recognize that this is the text that can be included. All right. So in a way, the counter-historian is endowed with historical tools. All right. That's the first point you need to remember, that the anecdotalist is actually a historian, and there's a continuity between sovereign power that overcame those lives and the discipline the anecdotalist practices. The disciplinary practice of history is a part of that power. There is a link between the power to resurrect and to end lives. All right. So the anecdotalist is involved. The anecdotalist has to see, has to recognize these anecdotes through a power structure. And what is the power structure through in which the anecdotalist is implicit? The disciplinary gaze. All right, because that's the only way it can become visible to us. The discipline of history, which is itself a part of the power structure, makes it possible for the counter historian to see these texts. So he is also implicit. The disciplinary analysis shows both the things a historian wants to see. Number one, what was thrown out from the mainstream narrative and how it was thrown out. Okay, no matter how revolting, we all are historians, we all, according to Foucault, are the heirs of the historical methods. We too are picking lives from archives and killing their essence by analyzing them. So the people who caught them and put them in jail were trying to erase their physical mark, their physicality, their visibility. And the historian, in trying to analyze their stories, erase their essence and erasing their mark metaphorically. So one way of erasing is the lives is through invective and bombast, the powerful measures, but the other one is regulating and formulating these existences into the discourse of human sciences. All right. So what can the counter historian do? The counter historian can bring the discourse of everyday life into scrutiny in order to question mainstream history through counter history. This also connects us with the first part of this essay, where Greenblatt told us that people who wrote everyday life history were also important for counter history. Let's move on to the next paragraph. Surely there was over-dramatization in imagining one's research to be implicated in the life and death struggles of even these unsung offenders. One cannot deny that an exaggerated sense of immediate moral brinkmanship featured prominently among Foucault's attractions, and it bears separate consideration here as we approach the conclusion of our discussion, for it discloses a final dimension of the counter-historical project. So Greenblatt says that there is an element of over-dramatization when Foucault talks about his research in terms of life and death, like a counter-historian when includes an anecdote, the counter-historian kills the essence and is complicit with power structures. So even if he is talking about the lives of the erased in silence, of course his writing has an element of dramatization. All right, he has an exaggerated sense of moral brinkmanship, again exaggerated sense of his moral responsibility in writing history. Okay, but Greenblatt also says that this feature of Foucault's writing brings us to the final aspect of counter history. And what is the final aspect of counter history that we are going to discuss now? The element of personal involvement. The personal involvement of the historian, his subjective point of view and his acknowledgement of that subjective point of view. I am reading from the text now. Foucault's rhetoric of personal involvement stood out from that of other counter-historians, first by the sheer complexity of his account of the relation between himself and his anecdotes, and second, because of the impossibility of that relation ever seeming satisfying or reassuring. He seemed frequently to be warning himself against any complacent separation between his desire to hear the voice of the other and his desire for disciplinary and institutional power. The very documents preserving the beguiling voices were, after all, the products of disciplinary ambition. His insistence on the complicity with the dirty business of power contributed to his success in jolting his readers out of the contemplative or analytical frame of mind in which history is normally read. The wish of the anecdotalist may always have been to revivify, to bring something back to life that had been buried deep in oblivion, and Foucault often underlined the macabre in implications of that wish. The revived creature comes back in the agony of its death throes. This sensationalism, this striving after terror and awe produced a heightened sense of being on the extremities of the historically knowable, at the very edge of what we could know cognitively about the past. So, Greenblatt goes on to tell you how Foucault is personally involved. Number one, There's a complexity to his account of the relation between himself and his anecdotes. Why he chose anecdotes? What are his prerequisites to choose a certain kind of anecdotes? What attracted him to some anecdotes? What was his personal feeling when he came across an account? So there's a complexity to his account. So his personal involvement is clear. Second, the relation between himself and his anecdotes never seems satisfying to him. It means that he is aware of his situation and he knows that a counter, and he emphasizes that a counter historian should always be aware of his situation, of his own implication in history, and that history is an expression of power. Alright. So Greenblatt says that Foucault warns himself repeatedly that his desire to hear the voice of the other is attached to his desire for disciplinary power, for institutional power. They are inextricably bound with each other. And see, why would someone write the stories down? It was an attempt to record the event. For what? To set example, to analyze later, to know, to be in control. This all is an act of institutional power. And when a historian includes such records into his narrative, this is an act of disciplinary ambition. They want to do something new. They want to write about these lives and gain a position in the field of history. So Foucault's insistence that the counter historian is involved in the exertion of power was substantial in waking historians up from a kind of sleep in which they considered that their work was completely objective, completely free of power dynamics, completely free of any subjective emotions. Even readers of history have a set way of reading history. They never question the historian. They always assume that the historian is not involved. They never accept that the act of writing and reading history is in itself an act of power. And although the wish of the anecdotalist is to bring back to life something that has been buried, we already told you how bringing back only makes the essence lost. And it appears that whatever has been put on paper is actually the anecdote, like a creature who's brought back to life, but when he comes alive, the creature is almost in his death throes. He is in painful agony of his death throes. Okay? So this sensationalism in Foucault is what produced a sense of heightened involvement in the process of history, and it also highlights the limits of a counter historian's knowledge, a historian's knowledge, the limit to human thought. Let's come back to the text now. Even the famous anecdote that opens the order of things, which is neither lurid nor macabre, records and tries to induce this effect. Foucault reports that upon reading a passage of Borges that purports to describe a Chinese encyclopedia's categorization of animals, animals are divided into these following categories. Okay, belonging to the emperor: B. embalmed, C. tame, D. sucking pigs, E. sirens, F. fabulous, G. stray dogs, H. included in the present classification, I. frenzied, J. innumerable, K. drawn with a very fine camel hair brush, J. innumerable, K. drawn with a very fine camel hair brush, L. etc., M. having just broken the water pitcher, N. that from a long way off look like flies. So Foucault broke into a laughter that shattered all the familiar landmarks of my thought, our thought, the thought that bears the stamp of our age and our geography, breaking up all the ordered surfaces and all the planes with which we are accustomed to tame the wild profusion of existing things, and continuing long afterwards to disturb and threaten with collapse of our age-old distinction between the same and the other. So in the pages that follow, there's a point that Greenblatt wants to make, which I want to summarize for you before going on to explain these passages. By including this passage from Borges, Greenblatt is trying to tell you that Foucault found the passage first funny, because it shattered all distinctions that we are used to. But then he realizes that in recognizing this passage as important to include in his book The Order of Things, that the counter historian's anecdotes are crazy, somewhat verging on to madness, someone verging on to such a great disorder that everything becomes sort of eccentric. So, on the one hand of the spectrum, there's pure order, like these are reptiles, these are amphibians, these are carnivorous animals, these are herbivorous animals. There's neat categorization, which is an expression of power. Our insistence on categorizing, classifying everything that we can know of. That's one end of the spectrum. The other is the counter historian's madness, in which there is no order. But Foucault goes on to tell you that in counter historian's madness, on close analyzing, we realize that there actually is an order. This order is a wild space, okay? Neither the thought nor the articulated. It is the middle ground. It is the order in its primary state, as Foucault calls it. It's the unspoken order that already exists into everything. All right, maybe a little less to analyze, but the order is there. So, this is what this section is going to summarize for you with a couple of examples. So, let's move ahead. The passage that was included, Borges' passage. So, he brings this anecdote which opens the order of things. It is an interesting anecdote when Foucault tells us that on reading this passage from Borges, which classifies animals into categories completely absurd. Are these categories absurd, or are we not used to such categories? We are so obsessed with classification, knowledge and ordering that this classification completely throws us out from of normal frames of understanding. All right, what we witness in this classification is something troublesome, something we find hard to accept because it's not falling into normal forms of classification that we are used to. So, first Foucault breaks out into a laughter because it shattered the familiar landmarks of his thought, our thought, okay. This normal frame of mind that we are so used to, the normalization of categories, is dependent, rather it's controlled by the power structures in the age and place that we live in. We want to create such a big distance between the same and the other. We try so hard to tame the wild profusion of existing things that this classification becomes the norm. All right, let's move forward. This is the anecdote about experiencing rather than thinking, the limits of our thought. In the wonderment of this taxonomy, the thing we apprehend in one great leap, the thing that by means of the fable is demonstrated as the exotic charm of another system of thought, is the limitation of our own, the stark impossibility of thinking that. Like Williams' semi-reports on quasi-experiences, this autobiographical anecdote gives us almost nothing in the way of positive knowledge. Neither Foucault nor the reader learns anything about China from Borges' completely fictitious passage. Rather, it reports an exaggerated, shattering and demonically comic instance of what Williams called trouble. So, you will realize that in the above classification, the boundaries of taxonomy, of categorization, the boundaries become fluid. We lose control, and whenever we lose control, it appears trouble, and trouble is what counter historians like Foucault and Williams and Greenblatt are looking for. Now, in this anecdote, it's not that we just reach the limits of our thought. We actually experience ourselves reaching at the limit of our thought. When you read this anecdote, when you read the classification, weren't you at the limit of your thought? You were trying to make sense of how these animals have been classified, and then coming to the edge of your thought that we don't understand, we're sort of losing control, we don't like that, and it's not that we don't like that, it's something new, it's a sensation. But it's something that we call trouble because we are so used to being in control, all right. So, Thus, the anecdote is not only a record of change, it also takes part in that change. The moment you experience yourself coming to the edge of thought, the anecdote has become the agent of bringing you to the edge of your thought. All right? This wakes up to the fact that we have been pathologically accustomed to the normal frame of thought, to the normal frame of categorization, to controlling everything around us and the information about them. Okay, so it's become so easy for us to other the animal in one great leap. Okay, these are the animals, we are the humans. We take such a great leap in othering the other creatures. All right, so this is a limitation of our own. It's not about animals, it's about our own limitations. We can't accept the wild profusion of things. We have to have control, and our insistence on classifying them so neatly is an expression of our need of control. Okay, so like William's experience, his concept of experience that will not give anything out in articulation, this anecdote as well does not give us anything concrete to put on paper and analyze. This anecdote gives us nothing in terms of knowledge. It gives us nothing in terms of what we are used to. Instead, what we come across is a complete shattering of our normal ways of thinking and classifying, and this is what William calls trouble. Foucault writes, there arose in its wake the suspicion that there is a worse kind of disorder than that of the incongruous, the linking together of things that are inappropriate. I mean the disorder in which fragments of a large number of possible orders glitter separately in the dimension without law or geometry of the heteroclite. So, after the laughter subsides, there appears a sense of uneasiness. Foucault is a counter-historian. The counter-historian is realizing that the kind of anecdotes he is choosing, in those anecdotes, a large number of possible orders glitter separately. The anecdotes, we've been reading this from the very beginning of this essay, that the anecdotes glitter separately, without law or geometry, without neat classified characteristic arrangement. These anecdotes are comfortable to be situated in the heteroclite, an order of disorder. Okay, so immediately Foucault realizes that there is something strange about his business, that whatever anecdotes he is choosing are strange in the sense that there is no set order, no normal order to what they are choosing, to their anecdotes. Okay, so what happens, Greenblatt says that this image of the collapse of any succession of ordering principles is the underside of the counter-historical anecdotalism we have been examining. Separate orders, those that have been as well as those that might have been, show their fragments in a dimension that is neither spatial nor temporal. No analytic pattern appears, no narrative arises that would identify the causal links between them, distinguish the realized from the potential, account for their differences or similarities. There is no order to these disparate orders. This is a nightmarish counter-history in which everything is present, all possible orders with no chronological sequence or ontological hierarchy. Now, like in Borges's example, we saw that the quasi-anecdotes that Williams chose in the last section and the lives of the infamous men that Foucault chose to anecdotalize did not follow any set rule, any set pattern, any obligation. There is a total collapse in the principles that usually guide historians. Usually what is chosen for historical analysis and what is not usually chosen is established formally or informally by definite disciplinary regulation, right? The tradition of history teaches you slowly what kind of accounts you can choose or what kind of accounts you can't choose. But this is not the case for counter-historians. They can choose whatever they like from wherever they like. The subject of their historical analysis can be whosoever they like. All right, and they can study almost anything, any supposedly insignificant document, trace, anecdote, life, along with the supposedly high and great and canonical literature. Thus, there is a total collapse of order in the counter-historian's world. Separate patterns, those that are or that might have been just appear as fragments, like William's concept of experience in Foucault's Lives. They appear as fragments bound neither by time nor space. No analytical pattern appears. A pattern only appears when there is at least a temporal or spatial consistency or continuity. Without that, no pattern appears. No narrative appears that show why what happened. We cannot distinguish between the realized from what could have been realized. There is no way we can justify their similarities or count their differences. Here we have to keep in mind Borges's example. The animals that appear in his classification is nothing like the classification we are used to take on for historical analysis. There is no causal links, no similarities, no differences, no actual and potential possibilities, no pattern appears through which we could analyze the given categories of animals. There is no set order, and yet they all exist. In Borges's anecdote, this, Greenblatt says, is a sort of nightmarish history in which everything is present. For a counter historian, everything can be included in history. All possible orders, no chronological sequence, no ontological hierarchy plays any important part for the counter historian. Everything can be taken up. Alright, all that history and science had achieved in terms of control of knowledge stands threatened in the hands of a counter historian. Okay. Let's continue with the text. One is tempted to say that this is an anecdote to end all anecdotes, because in it the counter-historian's utopia turns out to be madness. The desire to avoid ordering the historical diversity of orders, real and imagined, places him or her on the brink of thought itself. Everything is in shreds and there is no possibility of repair. And yet, this queasy encounter with ultimate disorder, this thinking in extremis, turns out to be the dread that often drives disciplines toward the discovery of, and pay attention, new orders, which are always apprehended or intuited in the interstices of the given cognitive grid. This is not simply to say once again that history and counter-history are inseparable. It is additionally to claim that the truly sensational anecdote, by emitting flashes of a horrific outside to any conceivable historical order, puts one beside oneself, momentarily beyond a merely cognitive relation to one's task. So, thus we see that counter-historian's utopia turns out to be madness, right? Greenblatt says that the desire to avoid order which was created by the mainstream history brings this counter-historian to the edge of his own thought, at a place where his thought reaches its limit. Everything that he knows, all the concepts, explanations, stories, their morals are in shreds and there is no hope for repair. And yet, the discomfort that Foucault felt after the laughter had subsided, the discomfort that every counter-historian feels, drives them to discover a new order. And where do we find that new order? At the borders of our given systems of thought. We have to first reach the edge of our systems of thought, the given systems of thought that we are so used to. Once we reach the edge of that thought, right, we find anecdotes, experiences, lives that show disruption of all order. They show trouble, all right, and when you encounter such trouble, one is thrown beside oneself beyond a merely cognitive relation to one's task, merely mental, merely objective. When one is thrown beyond the normality of history, then something deeper happens, something experiential happens that is beyond the established relations of cognitive systems. Basically, what Greenblatt is trying to tell you is that when you reach the edge of your thought, your experience gets involved in the writing of history. You experience reaching the edge of your thought. History gets an experiential dimension. That is what new historicism was all about, bringing the point of view of experiential events into history. Okay, and when one reaches to the edge of the thought, they realized that counter history and its anecdotes are actually not madness. There is an order, something deeper, which the counter historian can only realize when he reaches the edge of his thought. And what is this new order? He is going to explain to you now. The possibility of the experience of the heteroclite, what we might call the limit experience of counter history, motivates the more routine sensationalism of disciplinary activity described in The Order of Things. There, Foucault, rather like Williams, outlines a three-tiered cultural configuration. Two tiers, the lowest and the highest respectively are, number one, the mental grid or code according to which people process information and live their lives, and two, the fully articulated justification for that code. Foucault describes them as the fundamental codes of culture that establish for every man from the very first the empirical orders with which he will be dealing and within which he will be at home, and the scientific theories or the philosophical interpretations which explain why this particular order has been established and not some other. But the disciplines that interest Foucault, pay attention, originate in neither of these realms. They grow up in a wild space between, a space more confused, more obscure, probably less easy to analyze. Between the already encoded I and the reflexive knowledge there is reflexive knowledge. There's a middle region which liberates order, a middle region which liberates order, allowing imperceptible deviations from the primary codes. This middle ground is a place where culture finds itself faced with the stark fact that there exists, below the level of its primary orders, things that are in themselves capable of being ordered, that belong to a certain unspoken order, the fact, in short, that order exists. The impulses to find the unseen order and to criticize the culture's codes, which are the founding impulses of the disciplines Foucault investigates, arise from the pure experience of order and of its modes of being. Eventually, such experiences themselves might found general theories as to the ordering of things and thus become reflective knowledge. But the experience of order in its pure primary state always plays a critical role. It always obtrudes between the already encoded and reflexive knowledge. So, in his book, The Order of Things, Foucault establishes a three-tiered system of cultural formation. He mainly talks about two tiers. One is the mental grid, the way we understand things cognitively, and the other is articulation. Whatever we understand, we explain. So, these are the two levels. But he says that between these two levels, there exists a grey area, a wild space, a space that is more confused, obscure, less easy to analyze. All right. This space allows vast deviations from the primary codes that we are used to. It's not same as the primary codes that we are used to. All right. This area is a suggestion, especially for counter historians, that they shouldn't think that their business is madness. They should be assured, with the help of this grey area, that there actually exists an order. There's another level, there's another order. This order is unspoken. So, what is the difference between the order that mainstream historian maintains and the order that counter historian experiences? Yeah, that's it, that he experiences. Counter historians' order is based on their experience. When they encounter an anecdote that is strange, that is obscure, that arises some sensations in them, the sensational experience becomes the basis of that order. So, although if they discover new order on the basis of their experience, that order also becomes reflexive knowledge, that order also becomes articulated knowledge after a point of time. But the fact that this order was based on the counter historian's first hand experience in encountering these lives, in encountering these anecdotes, make this order of a pure state. All right. The experience always plays a critical part in this order, and that's how it is different from the mainstream historians' neat categorization. Foucault's experience of the possible non-existence of order recorded in his anecdote and this more quotidian experience of order in its pure primary state are certainly opposites. The first is a vague and sickening encounter with thought in ruins, while the second is an impression of grounding, of touching behind the cultural grid, a reality that is anterior to words, perceptions and gestures, more solid, more archaic, less dubious, always more true than the theories. So Foucault experiences these anecdotes on two levels. At the first level, the anecdote is total madness, thought in its ruin. It's a vague experience, a sickening experience, an encounter that puts you at the edge of your thought. But the moment you come to the edge of your thought and you realize that there's another kind of order, order in its pure primary state. Alright, it's the opposite of the previous madness. This order is a touching behind the cultural grid. It's a reality that is anterior to words, anterior to perceptions and gestures. It is more solid, more archaic, less dubious and more true than theories. Alright, so these are the two ways in which he experiences order. First, he thinks that a counter historian's business is absolute madness because there is no order. But then he realized that if you went to the edge of your thought, you experienced that feeling, you reach a state which shows you that there is an order which is of more pure and primary state, but it's not in the mental grid and it's not in the articulation. It's somewhere between the thought and the speech. All right. So Greenblatt continues to write, we are of course to understand that the solidity is partly illusory, for the order of things takes shifts in the seemingly intransigent, unspoken order as its subject. But those shifts take place when a group, a profession, a discipline, a sect believes it has encountered beneath the conventional codes an order that can serve as the basis for judging the codes themselves as more or less exact, more or less happy expressions of it. As experiences, therefore, the aftermath of the Borges reading and the confrontation with order in its primary state are as different as sensing an absence and sensing a presence. So Greenblatt says that this solidity is illusory, it's not actually real, in the sense that in the order of things in his book, Foucault does not refer to the unspoken order in a fixed manner. His meaning of unspoken order, the pure primary state of order, is shifted. But when do these shifts take place? He says that the pure primary state of order, the unspoken order between the mental grid and articulation, it shifts. But when does the shift happen? He says, when a profession, a discipline, a sect, when they believe that they have encountered beneath conventional codes, beneath normality, beneath mainstream history, beneath the set codes of classification, that the newly discovered order in its pure and primary state can be used to judge the codes themselves, to critique the conventional codes themselves. This newly discovered order becomes the basis for critiquing the mainstream conventions, mainstream codes. And in the same way that Williams found that the real true experience within the consciousness can never find exact articulation. In fact, one can't even experience the experience in the modern times, is what Williams said in the previous section. Similarly, in Foucault, there's an absence of order that he first discovers in Borges. Then he finds a presence of order. In the absence of conventional order, in the absence of conventional order, he finds a new kind of order, which is pure, primary, a wild space, a gray area, an in-between space. All right. Order in its pure primary state, the order that can be used to critique the conventional codes. So in a similar way that Williams found, the absence of experience to sense its presence. Similarly, the absence of order in Foucault finds order's presence in a new way to critique the conventional mainstream codes. All right, moving further, nevertheless, they both estrange us from our thought, the thought of our time. Both absence and both presence estrange us from our thought, the primary thought, the thought that the power structures have allowed us to limit our thought to. Okay, so the presence and absence of experience, the presence and absence of an order, they estrange us from our conventional codes given to us by the power structures. They both bring the mind up against the given empirical codes as limitations, causing them to lose their original transparency and introducing the notion that these orders are perhaps not the only possible ones. So, the result of sensing this absence and presence is that we are estranged from our conventional frames of thought. They make us more alert as readers and as counter-historians perhaps. They make us more alert and awake against the traditional modes of thinking we have naturalized and internalized. Alright? They help us view our set modes of thinking and interpretations as limitation. The way we think, the way we are accustomed to think, our impositions, our limitations. And you should know that whatever you read, the history, the things that are supposed to be true are not transparent, and they are not what we assume them to be. And this makes us aware that newer kinds of orders exist. The kind of orders that we are used to are not the only ones that exist. Okay. Greenblatt further writes, they are both therefore liminal experiences, confused encounters on the edge of thought with something that can be sensed but not fully grasped. All right, this should be clear that they are both liminal experiences. They are not mainstream experiences, grand experiences. These are confused encounters on the edge of thought with something that can be sensed but not fully grasped. You should immediately go back with this phrase to Williams. Something that can, experiences were something for Williams that could be felt but never articulated. All right, for Foucault, this order can be sensed but not fully grasped. Like the order of things itself, the disciplines spring from the limit experience of the other. Disciplines spring from the limit experience of the other, and they cannot entirely exorcise the alterity within. So, encounter history is thus created. We encounter the limit experience of the other. We are at the edge of our thought and just about to enter the new order. All right. So, we feel that there is an alterity that is at work within disciplines, and from which disciplines arise. It is in sensing the presence of another order from which disciplines emerge, and therefore these disciplines have an alterity within which is very hard, almost impossible to do away with. All right, coming to the final paragraph. Counter histories have tried instead to revive that alterity, fostering disciplinary eccentricity, and it was that eccentricity that the anecdote carried into literary criticism as well. The force field of the anecdote pulled even the most canonical works off to the border of history and into the company of nearly forgotten and unfamiliar existences. There, literature's own dormant counter-historical life might be reanimated, possibilities cut short, imaginings left unrealized, projects half formulated, ambitions squelched, doubts, dissatisfactions and longings half felt might all be detected there. They were buried beneath the surface, no doubt, but would stir, one hoped, at the touch of the real. So, counter-historians have tried to revive that alterity that is within every discipline, but one has to discover the order that's hidden, the order that when you discover, when you reach the edge of your thought and challenge the conventional notions. All right. So, counter-historians have tried to revive this alterity. They like this alterity. They have welcomed the disciplinary weirdness, and the anecdote became a perfect medium for it. The anecdotes, when studied along with the most canonical works, pulled those canonical works off from the high stage on which people had situated them. They pulled them off from the borders of high history and put them with forgotten ones. Okay? Thus, in anecdotes, when studied with canonical works, literature's own counter-historical tendencies are revealed. Okay? How literature can be an agent in uncovering hidden histories? By studying canonical texts along with forgotten anecdotes. And what do we encounter when we discover counter-history through anecdotes? That there were some possibilities that were cut short. There were some imaginings that were left unrealized. There were some projects that were half formulated. There were ambitions that were squelched, and there were doubts, dissatisfactions, longings which were half felt. We can detect all these impulses when we study anecdotes in literature. Okay? We find gaps in the discourse of high literature. Alright, these anecdotes, these weird eccentric accounts were buried beneath the surface, but through a counter-historical impulse, one hoped they could still stir the touch of the real into literary criticism.